Good morning to those of you who are already online. We will be starting in approximately 3 minutes' time. Thank you. Good morning to everybody. We still have a lot of people joining the webinar, so we will be starting in approximately 2 minutes' time. Thank you very much. Good morning. We'll be starting in approximately 1 minute's time, so your last chance to make a cup of tea before we start. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's event. Thank you for joining us. This is the 9th of our Wednesday webinars, and I believe we had around 450 people registered for today, and there's certainly a good number joining, and one or two are still trickling in, I see. On behalf of the CLA, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event, which I'm sure will be very informative, and hopefully you'll all learn a lot from it. My name is Mark Riches. Many of you will already know me, but I'm the Regional Director for the CLA in the Midlands region, and I'll be your chair for today. Before we start, I just want to give you a very quick reminder about the CLA's coronavirus webpage. We put this together. It's hopefully a one-stop shop for all you need to know during the coronavirus outbreak, and hopefully will be very informative for you. I would also encourage you to read the CLA briefing paper on restarting the rural economy, something we've put a lot of work into, and something that will be very useful to all members and those of you who run farms and rural businesses. My thanks, or our thanks, must go to Stratton Parker, to Barclays and to Erwin Mitchell, all of who have a speaking slot today, and who are our partners for this event, so we extend our thanks to them. Just a reminder that today's session is being recorded for future use, including availability to other members. So if you miss anything today, you can download it at some point once we've uploaded it to the website. The format is going to be along the following lines. Each presenter will give you their presentation. You can ask questions at any time during the session, and if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a little button that says Q&A. If I could please ask you to put your questions into that Q&A section rather than on the chat. It won't, if your questions go into the chat, I won't be able to pick them up, so they need to go into that Q&A box specifically. I'd ask you to please restrict your questions to the subject matter for today, and if you have any other questions, please approach the CLA, your CLA regional office for advice in the normal manner. So on to planning. There's a list of today's speakers and a little bit about each of them. The subject of planning affects everything we do. The houses we live in, the developments we undertake, the businesses we run are all affected and very often constrained by the planning system. It's a subject that at the CLA we probably get asked about the most. So it's from permitted development to housing, to planning conditions, application processes and enforcement. Just a little story before we start. About 4 years ago, someone phoned me up asking about planning enforcement. They had an enforcement notice served upon them, and they had the enforcement officer coming out to see them. This was at 10 to 2 in the afternoon, and they informed me that the enforcement officer was arriving at 2 o'clock. So this takes me on to my particular ask from you today. If you take away one particular thing, when dealing with planning matters or any queries, please contact your CLA regional office as early as possible for advice. All advice you get is included free with your CLA membership, and in the long run, it could save you an awful lot of time and money. So please do use the resource within the CLA that is available to you. I shall now pass on to John McClarty, who is going to be giving our first slide on planning for change. So John, if you're there, over to you.
Mark, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I believe I've now got control of the slides, so I'll be able to click on here. So a bit of background first of all. My name is John McClarty. I lead the development and planning business nationally for Stratton Parker and work out of our London office. I'm responsible for a number of different areas, from strategic planning right through to grassroots planning, as you would expect. The topic today I'm going to cover is around planning for change, and we're going to talk a bit about vision and a little bit about the planning white paper as well. But let's get kicked off first of all. Villages, towns, how we look at delivery of need is all changing, and given the COVID crisis we're all in at the current time, significant change is going to happen. How we look at the nibble at the village, how we look at major growth and change in the village, and how we look at our care and our retirement area, very, very topical at the moment for very different reasons, and how we actually look at physical delivery. Garden villages and garden discussions clearly are an issue, but things are moving on from there. And on to my next slide. The scale of change, how we look at the countryside and our rural economy is a question already posed by someone in the audience today. But then actually how you look at design and how the vision is going to change in the coming few months. This is something just completed in the last year. Fantastic design, modern living, modern lifestyle, garden village dream maybe, or maybe not for others. But ultimately, the design is going to be at the heart of the changing planning system. And we believe that actually good, strong vernacular design can work. Look at this, we've even got some estate railings in this particular scene. But it's really about what's going to happen in the future. And we think there's quite a change coming with new government initiatives announced in March. Obviously, they're going to see significant change in how development corporations come in, but also how we look at our infrastructure funding in the long term. A lot of change around infrastructure at the current time. A very ambitious programme, as you'll see here, for affordable homes. 9.5 billion programme being announced here, and 27 billion of investment for a strategic road network. The roads are increasing in traffic in the last few days and weeks, but actually we have seen a different way of using our homes and obviously not commuting in such long distances. The trunk roads are going to get significant investment, and that will be a catalyst through development in many cases. How we look at our cities and obviously the land around that is going to be very topical in terms of the integration of that transport package. And a big topic for all of you is around flooding and flood defences. And again, major investment being proposed by the government, as well as these new city deals and growth deals. So lots of investment was being suggested at that time. The main topic I wanted to cover with you today was around the planning white paper. And it's very clear to me that there are going to be changes, and the topics and the discussion in the last few days, we've been listening to Secretary of State, there's something coming here. If there's going to be a July announcement around this in terms of a sort of a short-term budget or discussion just around the planning white paper, but we've picked this up in the planning world in the last few days about some fairly radical changes. What does that actually mean in planning terms? Well, the government's clearly got some objectives, and looking at local people and first-time buyers for more homes is very, very important. And it's been a policy that hasn't really worked in recent years and needs a real overhaul, and that formed part of the Planning for Futures paper, and I believe will come part of the planning white paper in the coming months. Creating beautiful, sustainable places, I'll leave that alone for today. There's experts on the line today to deal with that, but it's absolutely fundamental how we look at design and change around that. More efficiency and the accessibility of the planning system. I was speaking to the chief officer of a local authority who had 600 people on a planning committee the other evening on Zoom. Quite incredible. The way we're all interacting is really positive for planning, and there's a real opportunity then for more engagement at a local level. You don't need to go off on a drafty Tuesday evening to a village hall to a planning meeting. You can now do it on a system such as this. Home ownership and obviously how we modernise our workforce are very topical areas as well. So lots of change here as well. Underpinning this will be a very, very large fund of just over 10.9 billion, which will be used across the UK for some of these initiatives. But let's see how that comes out in the planning white paper in the coming few weeks. And then moving on to the responses and comments around this, what's going to change? And the Royal Town Planning Institute have looked at this, and other groups as well. But invest in place. And that could be a rural place, that could be a rural village. It could be an urban setting, how you look at place and obviously clearly design. The refocus on 21st century issues, the things that are affecting us all right now, the digital transformation, how we've all adapted in 12 weeks is quite remarkable as a nation. Strategic planning underpins all of this, and ultimately how the planning system works, a local plan system, a plan-led system. One of the things coming out from government we've seen in the last few days and being publicised is around the risk of deregulation and US-style zoning, so changing the rules. This could be quite interesting to see how that pans out as well. And moving on to another slide. It's just gone a bit slow here. I think the deregulation change is going to be quite challenging for us all. And we're going to see that being a real issue for us in terms of how that works. And really it's just posed some questions here. So what is next for us all? Well, I think increased rural office space has to got to be right on that agenda, hasn't it? How things are going to change and how people work in cities and towns. Design of housing for home working. Warehouse and distribution. The Amazon world, the culture of click and collect is very, very much changing how we look and adapt. The opportunity around transport systems we've also touched on, but I think leisure and recreation will see significant and large growth, a real opportunity there again. And finally, a new village high street. I live in a village. Actually, the change in the village has been quite remarkable, how people are using local facilities. Will they go back to the norm after this crisis, or will they stay hopefully robustly using local facilities? I hope it's certainly the latter. This is an urban setting. Clearly, we haven't seen this for an awful long time, but this is something that we may be moving away from. We could see more of this, more of the conversion world, which we'll be coming on to, no doubt, in talks shortly after mine, and how that can be done, again, through great design, but also creating collaborative space for people to talk, learn, young people to engage. And finally, from me, maybe the working environment's going to change. This is one of the shots from one of my colleagues in our Scottish office on the purple chair. But actually how we work. Maybe the jacuzzi will form part of the working environment in the background, or maybe just working outdoors. Who knows? But actually visionary is what we need to be as a planning system, always looking forward and looking for opportunities. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavour of what's going on. I think we watch with interest what's going to happen in July with regards to the planning white paper, but hopefully I've given you a bit of a background to where things are heading. Thank you very much. What I'd like to do now is pass on to Fenella Collins, Head of Planning at the CLA. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, John, for that introduction. And yes, I'm going to take you through a brief presentation that that covers the CLA's Rural Powerhouse campaign for a planning system designed for economies and communities in rural areas, which is the second theme of the Rural Powerhouse campaign, which was launched in 2019 as part of the general election. And it emerged from the idea that with the right policy platform, the economy in rural areas has a tremendous potential for economic growth, job creation, and wider prosperity. And the report, when it's finalised, the CLA report into the planning system, will explain why a simpler and properly resourced planning system can actually support, enable and enhance development in rural areas. But obviously it needs some changes before we get there. So I want to talk about two key areas that are in the report. One is about levelling up, and the second one is about the planning system itself. I'm aware, because I've already seen some questions that people are concerned about the fact that, you know, one often gets a no. So let's see if we can change the planning system so that we start getting yeses, especially for small scale development in rural areas. But I think just to take the three challenges that we're facing at the moment, and these were challenges that existed before the coronavirus came on the scene in January. And that is around Brexit and the fact that the economy in rural areas is entering a period of significant change, perhaps the biggest since we entered the Common Agricultural Policy about 50 years ago. And our departure from the European Union and the new trading relationships that will generate is going to create both opportunities and risks for rural businesses of all types. These changes will come alongside new expectations and perceptions about what the countryside is for, and the nature and makeup of the economy in rural areas. The CLA report really is focusing on, it would like to focus on radical change, and I've no doubt that we have got radical change coming along. But at this stage, and because of the COVID-19 emergency, we actually have focused on things that need changing now. And there will be the need to consider more fundamental change. But those changes that could be made more quickly with limited cost and disruption to get the economy in rural areas moving are required. And these come with these three challenges, which is firstly the levelling up of community needs in rural areas. There are the hopes and needs of communities for better jobs, better housing, transport, or at least more housing, transport, services and leisure are very similar to those in urban areas. Yet many in the countryside continue to feel that they're not receiving the benefits of economic growth at the right scale, at the right time and at the right place, I hasten to add. And that the government and some stakeholders really don't understand the relationship between rural businesses, rural life and the environment. And as an example, we ran a survey in 2018 called Strong Foundations, and it concerned sustainable villages. We found thousands of small villages classed as unsustainable in local plans because they no longer have post offices or access to public transport. And as a result, they are in a permanent cycle of decline. And when you look at why that is, it's because local authorities' sustainability assessments for these villages are focusing on the need for access to a post office or a bank or public transport, when in fact it should be focusing on what is required today, which modern day needs, which is broadband. And of the local authorities we surveyed, only 18% of them actually included the availability of broadband in their sustainability assessments. So there's something that needs to be changed. Then there's levelling up the rural economy, the economy in rural areas. The economy in rural areas, there is no doubt, it lags behind urban economies. The traditional image of rural economies is dominated by primary industries, agriculture and forestry, and small-scale seasonal tourism. I would suggest is increasingly anachronistic. In fact, businesses in rural areas, the sectoral composition of businesses in rural areas is largely similar to that in urban areas, although at a different scale. But the business base in rural areas is not just growing, but it's becoming much more sophisticated, creative and innovative, despite the issue of delivering broadband. But rural areas have a 10% lower productivity compared to urban areas and a continuing skills shortage. And these must be improved, and the planning system must play its part in doing so. And then, of course, there is recovering from the impact of the economic impact of coronavirus. We've seen this very much so within the CLA, with which has had a hugely damaging effect on the economy in rural areas across all sectors, but particularly, as I'm sure you're aware, leisure, tourism, events, and hospitality. And they've, income has been wiped out from one day to the next. Some of that damage is unlikely to come back. And then we have a very restrictive planning system. I would go so far as to say that the planning system is actually dysfunctional. We've had thousands of reports that have tried to improve the planning system. Unfortunately, an awful lot of that has actually made the planning system even more complex than it is today. And as it applies to businesses in rural areas, we continue to see it as the most significant barrier to economic growth. The plan-led planning system versus local plan status, well, we have a plan-led planning system and we exist within that. It means that decisions are made on planning applications by reference to local plans. It means that those local plans must be up to date. One of the key concerns about the planning system is how under-resourced it is. And there is no doubt that if you've lost 55% of your funding, how can you run a planning system that is increasingly complex? And targets that have, there's some speeding up of targets has happened, but we've been left with very inconsistent, complex approach. Solutions, the most important solution for me at the moment, well, all of those are important, but resourcing the planning system is key. It has to be properly resourced. And I think that the government has to decide what planning system it wants to have and what it wants it to deliver, and then produce adequate resources to run it. Otherwise, we will continue to have a system that is dysfunctional. The National Planning Policy Framework, I think we're heading for another review of that later this year. And the CLA is going to be lobbying very hard to try and bring the economic development policies from Chapter 6 in the NPPF back to Chapter 1. Whether we will be successful, I don't know, but it is hugely important that economic development, including rural economic development, is at the forefront of the National Planning Policy Framework if we're to move forward. And then we have a number of proposals in our report about development management and streamlining application processes. And I think I'm going to stop there and hand over now to Judith Norris of the Rural Planning Practice, who is going to take you through what she sees is happening at the coalface. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Fenella. The CLA does great lobbying work, and the recent pandemic has shown that broadband and not a bus stop is the key to sustainability. Well, what is happening on the planning front now, and what is the impact of the COVID crisis? I will just run through some observations. Planning authorities are keeping going. Officers are working remotely, making some of them more easily contactable than usual. One officer even advised the system is a little more relaxed. Now may be the moment to put in for some of your more interesting ideas. Timescales have not been dropped, but inevitably there are delays. As John said, the art of virtual planning committee is being perfected. Many authorities are now playing catch up with meetings often at fortnightly intervals. The organisation that is lagging badly behind is the Planning Inspectorate, which struggles because of third-party involvement. Only now it is experimenting with some virtual hearings. In terms of financial contributions, there is a recognition that developers will be financially stretched, both during and after the pandemic, while the strength of the housing market is uncertain. The government has advised planning authorities to allow deferral of SIL payments and some leeway on interest for smaller developers. But of course, the strict requirement for notices to be served at the correct time remains. Authorities have also been advised to take a flexible view of Section 106 payments. Local plans are continuing through the system and are seen as a means of helping the economy to recover. Almost finished neighbourhood plans are being given weight in decision making if they have missed their referendum as the result of COVID restrictions. With pandemics becoming a factor in all our lives, the number of people seeking to leave urban areas is likely to increase. Its legacy will heighten concern about housing quality and neighbourhoods and open spaces, and, as Fenella so clearly stated, opportunities for work in the countryside. The 20-minute block giving a village scale to larger urban developments will be seen as important, with as many facilities as possible within walking distance. Notwithstanding COVID, the government remains intent on achieving its target of 300,000 houses a year, but current indicators suggest that as a result of the pandemic, the housing delivery test will not be met by a significant number of authorities. The dreaded mantra remains that new dwellings in the countryside is a no-no, but a more flexible approach could see the rural areas contribute usefully to housing numbers. Some authorities, for example, Cotswold District Council, have planning policies that allow small developments in small settlements, even without facilities, to allow continued organic growth of villages. This is sensible. Planning inspectors, in my experience, also recognise the value of even a small number of houses as contributors to supply, but planning authorities are often dismissive. Planning authorities have a continuing love-hate relationship with Class Q, agricultural buildings into houses, but it has provided a useful source of rural housing, and I hope it stays. The document issued by the government post the budget, Planning for the Future, the precursor to the white paper, is very urban-centric, with a stated preference for development near existing settlements. I do, however, endorse its view that infrastructure should come first, and brownfield land should be used where possible. The document recognises the importance of the rental sector. Self-build is a very useful vehicle, but needs to be more flexibly applied. Use of technology is a no-brainer. Moving away from housing, I have some ongoing wider concerns which relate to the Glover Review and the future of national parks and AONBs. The review talks about merging both designations to become national landscapes. I have been involved in a recent planning appeal for an estate on the South Downs that was dismissed because the South Downs National Park local plan had a policy that related to tranquility and the need for development to preserve and enhance it. This is worrying. It smacks of a countryside in aspect. You will all be aware the Environment Bill, the Agriculture Bill, and the National Planning Policy Framework are looking to secure biodiversity net gain. This is clearly an opportunity for landowners to provide land for mitigation. The DEFRA metric is quite complicated, but is supposed to be transparent in terms of outcome. However, just a word of caution. An authority I work for has introduced a policy in its emerging local plan that is being used in advance of adoption. We achieved a permission for a small housing site in the countryside with 5 houses to find that despite our metric calculations being rather less, the authority is looking for £18,000, a lot of money for 5 houses. Needless to say, the discussions continue, but the transparency is not particularly evident. In my view, as a practitioner, the wholesale reform of the planning system that has been mooted by the government with blue sky thinking will be too resource hungry to be affordable in post-COVID England and Wales. In reality, we will end up with further tweaking of the system we have come to know and find wanting, especially for development in rural areas. I'm sorry to end on a depressing note. Anyway, I'm now passing you over to our next speaker, who is Tina Webster, a partner of the real estate group of Irwin Mitchell. She will give insight to those of you seeking to promote land for development and advice on working with developers. Tina, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Judith, and thank you very much for that really interesting talk. As Judith explained, I'm a partner in the real estate group of Irwin Mitchell, and I'm going to be talking to you today about promoting land for development, so rather larger scale size. We're talking here about land which sits outside the settlement boundary areas, so it's very much greenfield development. As Judith explained, government has a policy of 300,000 new dwellings per year, and they've made it very clear they're not going to adjust down this target to reflect the impact of COVID. Last year, we reached 241,000 new homes. So there's a way to go, and it's very clear that COVID's had a severe impact on housing delivery. Both John and Judith have talked about planning for the future. this forecast, what's going to come out in the white paper. And it's extremely clear that the government sees planning, the real development in the around housing as a way of supporting and indeed enhancing the recovery for what is a really severe downturn. So this does present an opportunity for landowners to get back involved. And my one message today is to get engaged and to get engaged early. So what is land promotion? How do you go about it? As has been explained by the previous speakers, we do have a plan-led system. So a local plan requires you to promote land through that system and with the other development plan documents which Judith has talked about. The promotion of land through the local plan system is long-term. It is now very technical and very expensive, and local planning authorities require promoters of land to actually make the case for releasing their land for development, which involves a huge amount of technical work. We have found that in the past, landowners have generally turned to the development industry to try and manage that process and pay for the promotion. And the end product has tended to be securing planning permission and then seeing the land sold. What I want to do is actually ask landowners to look more into the future and how they can become involved in actually controlling the development and actually seeing a greater degree of sustainable development. And just as an aside, what is very clear is that the government is looking for wide-scale changes to the planning system. But as Fenella and Judith said, whether or not that will happen is really questionable. They've talked a lot about using local development orders and zoning, and also extending permitted development rights. So we're bound to see more of that. If you're looking to engage with the development industry, how do you do that? I'm sure that many of you are going to be aware of the contractual structures. And engaging with the development industry is never easy. They're keen to secure your land and you're keen to actually secure the best price for the land. And there are two main routes: strategic options and promotion agreements, advantages and disadvantages of both. In some cases, we actually see landowners opting for promotion agreements where the promoter doesn't have the right to buy in the land, but has the ability to call for a sale. Whereas an option agreement, the developer has the right to buy in at a discount once he's secured planning permission. Whether or not when we have a zonal planning system with permissions in principle or development consent orders, it will all change it remains to be seen. One point which I do want to emphasise, that if there are multiple landowners involved, it's extraordinarily important to get your consortium collaboration arrangements in place very early. These deals with a number of issues: cost sharing, equalisation of value, how you make decisions. But it's extremely important that you actually collaborate with your neighbours and indeed collaborate with the local planning authority as early as possible. Otherwise, you cannot evidence that you can actually deliver your site. And in many ways, you can be picked off by the development industry. These arrangements are extraordinarily complicated in many cases, and they're often tax driven. So they do take time, but with time, we can sort them out. I just wanted to dwell on a few points. It's very clear that the government is looking for greater use of compulsory purchase powers for land assembly. They've seen a number of big developments which haven't come forward. And so we may see that land owners are forced to sell in order to facilitate development where their land has been allocated. They want to see greater transparency on land ownerships. They're going to pass legislation to enable them to see the terms of option and who actually controls the land. They want to see consented land built out. So this may throw into doubt all those suspension clauses we write into strategic land documentation. So promotion of land is difficult. We have seen an attempt to bring garden communities forward they're a great idea, but they're very different from edge of urban developments. But it is an opportunity for landowners to become more involved in the long-term placemaking. As Fenella and Judith have said, we have a real objective to achieve net zero 2050, and many people are trying to bring that forward, and also biodiversity gain. And looking at all of the new papers that are coming out, it's very clear that green infrastructure is going to play a very important role in new developments. And here again, I want landowners to think about the role they can play in long-term management. Having acted and been involved with many developers, we realise they're not the best vehicle for actually managing long-term land ownership. Landowners are very well placed in many cases to deal with ecological habitats and similar provision. And so whilst landowners may just be involved and may be approached by developers to hand over their land, you will find that developers will often ask landowners to become more engaged in actually managing that land and making sure that provision is available in order to support the development of their land. So that's another area where you need to watch this space and see what your role can be in order to manage the future sustainable development. So my real message is get involved early, try and manage the process, don't just hand it all over to the development industry, and look to see if you can have some long-term involvement in the promotion of your land and the development of the space. Right, I'm now going to hand over to Nicholas Boyce-Smith. Nicholas is the founding director of Create Streets, and he's the co-chair of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Tina. Hopefully I've got control. Yes, I do. So my name is Nicholas Boyce-Smith. I run a social enterprise called Create Streets, and oh, I've gone too far ahead. Sorry, I was trying to take control there. And I was chairing the government's Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission during 2019. The context of what we were set up to do was the need for new homes of all types and tenures, government's aim to be carbon neutral by 2050, the need to end the scandal left behind places, and the realisation that as a society we need to be worrying far more about mental health and well-being. It was quite a controversial commission when it was first set up, but we actually encountered very startling evidence and very strong support for the idea that the quality of the places we create needs to be far more profoundly embedded in how we think about what we do in cities, in towns, and in villages in the countryside. We saw very strong support from professional bodies. So there's a slight delay online. We saw very strong support from surveys that were run. But beauty and the quality of what we create was important and had been understated for several generations. We chose to define beauty broadly at three scales: building, the place, and also the spirit of the place and how our settlement patterns sit and interact with nature. We can and do create beautiful places still today. Here, hopefully in a second, is Goldsmith Street in Norwich and Savoy Circus. Sorry, this bit's meant to go quickly and it won't. Savoy Circus in London, the Wintles in Shropshire, and also coming up in a moment is the Bourne Estate in Nans-Leadon. However, too often we don't, and the public, we discovered, sees the planning process as a shield, not a sword. Aesthetic considerations are in the context of listed buildings and conservation areas. That's Bourne Estate from London. However, we need to be forward-looking. And hang on, I just have to. Sorry, it's just catching up here. Sorry, I was meant to zoom through these in seconds, so I apologise for this. And hang on. So the aim is that. Oh, heavens above. Sorry about this. There's a slight delay on the line, and I'm just trying to get to catch up. That instead of creating things that are ugly, we create things that actually people respond to and like. Now, contractually, in order to have the use of this next image that is hopefully coming up in a second, I'm not allowed to say anything rude about it, and so I shan't do that. Indeed, when it comes up, oh no, that's not the next one. I apologise. I just need to. I'll jump on. So the slides have to catch up. Underpinning much of the report were three key. That's the one I'm not allowed to be contractually allowed to be rude about. Underpinning much of the report were three key insights. The first was that we are creating less good places than we did centuries ago. The polling, pricing, and focus group data is incredibly clear on this. A toxic cocktail of technology. So we are now able to build things incredibly cheaply at huge scale when we want to, but also profound confusion about the role of the car in our town and village centres. That's not moving forward at all. Means that together with, so I'm now miles behind. So development can be the cause of hunger, but it's also the cure. And I'm now trying to get on to examples of the fact we can build huge buildings very cheaply, which is hopefully coming up in a second. I'll move on. The second key insight is that the idea that design is dangerous is a subjective myth. So what people like, where they want to be, is increasingly predictable. What we live has got a measurable, where we live has got a measurable effect on our physical and mental health. That's the building that was built very cheaply. How much we walk, how many neighbours we know, how tense we feel on the quotidian journey to work, and the presence of variables such as street trees, clear block patterns, legible street network, facades that most people find attractive, colour, coherent complexity, and near symmetry. There should be slides and all these appearing, but I'm afraid that they're not. Can all be associated with more walking, less crime, with better health. That's the confusion on the roads, and more support for development. Gentle density neighbourhoods, a historic town, a suburb, that's street trees, a village, are all associated with better well-being outcomes for residents. And it's a matter of social justice as well. So quite provably, more prosperous people live in areas which are better for their health and are happy. So our third insight, I don't know how many slides ahead of myself. Our third insight is there's always been some role for the state in regulating our government. It's part of the irreducible core of what government does. Debate up now, this morning, is very interesting. What is deregulation and what is regulating better? One of the slides that we're coming up shortly is of Mohenjo-Daro, which is one of the world's most ancient cities. There's very clear evidence of some form of state involvement in the block matter. But just because there needs to be state involvement, needs to be planning, doesn't mean we're doing it right. I think where we got to was a core insight that there was too much chaos and uncertainty, lack of clarity, and therefore lack of public trust in the planning system. And I promise I'm on the home stretch now. So what should we do about it? What were the proposals we came up with? Well, we had 8 key themes, which will come up on your screens in a little while. First was planning. We need to create, there's Mohenjo-Daro, and there's planning regulation. I hope I haven't got ahead of myself, but these are our 8 key themes. I finally caught up. We need to create a predictable level playing field. Communities, we need to bring the democracy forward from the development control-led system to the plan-making system. We're not in any way involving the public in our plan making at the moment, despite best efforts. Stewardship, incentivising responsibility for the future. That touches very much on what Tina was saying about the different approaches to development. Those are the 3 I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail. We also talked about regeneration, ending the scandal of left behind places, how we can create better neighbourhoods, not just houses, the need to regreen our towns and cities, and what we need to do with the architectural education system, and important stuff on how public sector does procurement. I won't have time to go into those in more detail. So the first of our themes was planning and the need to create a predictable level playing field. First of all, we said that beautiful placemaking should be a legally enshrined aim of the planning system that will actually go into the next iteration of the MPF. In a way, the more important point, so this is where I am now, these are our 10 proposals on this, was actually we're not really plan-led. We say we're plan-led, but in fact, we've got one of the most adversarial and litigious planning systems in the world. And that slide, I'm now finally caught up with myself. It does a comparison as to actually how much clarity our plan gives versus the plans of other countries. Local plans need to be more visual. They need to make more use of tools such as design codes and pattern books. We should permit a fast track for beauty for developments that clearly meet these. So there needs to be a much greater clarity about what's acceptable in certain circumstances. And we understand why permitted development was extended to office to resi conversion. That hasn't worked. Permitted development, local development models need to have some very clear standards. It can't just be deregulation, it just has to be clearer regulation. And there's very consistent evidence that the most effective regulation is clearer. But the second theme, and I'm going to touch on this incredibly quickly, is just on communities. And the need to bring engagement using digital tools, such as the one you just saw for a second, into the plan making process. And the third theme, which I'm just going to touch on for a second, is just on stewardship. And we investigated in some detail the ways in which the fiscal system is encouraging essentially the selling of land straight onto a developer or optioning, rather than the creating of panels and pooling capital, pooling land. We also had far more on. I seem to have lost control. So Amy, okay, Amy's trying to take over. The government's response to our report was incredibly positive. So basically, Robert Jenrick said that he was minded to introduce all of it, but obviously then COVID-19 struck. So we are still awaiting the formal response. What we've heard informally and formally is that we expect a good response. We expect it to be widely played into the white paper and to the new MPPF. Obviously, recent announcements, actually, I think IC is very coterminous with what we were saying in terms of bringing greater clarity into the planning system, so it is clearer what can be done and can't be done. Amy, you've I can't control my pack anymore, but I need to now hand over to Carl McConneville from Barclays Bank.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I hope you're all well. More perspective of you, and certainly anybody who knows me or anybody who knows Carl very well will realise that I'm not actually Carl McConneville. Apologies, he says he's just been unable to make it this morning, so I'm a last-minute substitute. Some really interesting presentations there, and you know, from our perspective as a bank, as an organisation, you know, we've heard a lot about being embedded in the community, the rural community. You know, Barclays, we do consider ourselves to be part of that rural infrastructure, whether it's through development, through farming, or you know, just the general sort of rural economy. And I suppose that kind of leads me on to thinking about, you know, traditionally, I think estates, large farms, you can still see that footprint where the village, the hamlet, the community was built up around that farm. And whilst agriculture is always at the key of the rural community, you know, we are seeing far more people access the countryside, holidays, added value, processing, but that footprint of development sort of still remains, and we can see it as we're driving in and around the countryside as we all do our jobs and get about our lives. I think more recently, probably on a slightly personal note, we do seem to have seen some sort of mass housing involving sale of assets, clearly, and it does serve a purpose. But you know, sometimes some of those developments seem to lack water management. Certainly, one of the villages near here has flooded 2 winters in a row, and most of it seems to be that there is no water management on a lot of the development, and also infrastructure, and you know, rather what Nicholas was just talking about, that sort of social infrastructure and how people live their lives. I think what this pandemic will do is it will change people's work-life balance, work-life outlook. I think we need to consider, and not just employees, but employers as well. You know, just to give you one example, I think we've moved from having about 10,000 people in the UK working from home, myself being one of those original 10,000, to having over 70,000 employees all able to work remotely. You know, if we do nothing post-COVID about our work, our balance, where we work from and how we work, I would be exceedingly surprised. What we do know from our experience helping landed estates, large farms through a sort of development process and a development cycle is that with some good planning advice, some good engagement in the community, a clear vision, probably we can move more towards that sort of home, community, work, leisure, commercial, office, and that blend that historically we always saw in a landed estate. There is a real chance here for landowners, for landed estates, to actually create a real legacy. And you know, Tina mentioned it about, you know, not just selling to a developer, but retaining control. So for us, sale is fine, especially as it's if it's part of a larger strategic plan for the estate or farm. But as a bank, we're supporting a number of clients across the UK retain ownership and therefore, of course, retaining control, which is vitally important if that development is going to be on the edge of an estate or the edge of a village that means an awful lot to the heritage of that estate. And we're supporting some of our clients develop it out and create, like I say, a positive legacy that takes into account all sorts of things that might be important for that particular estate, that family, and that ownership. So it is an interesting concept that actually it needn't always mean complete sale of the asset and passing on responsibility to someone else. And it's an amazing thing to, whether it's development, farming, agriculture, rural business, working together with clients and empowering them to make their own decisions is a hugely rewarding thing, I can assure you. With that, I will hand back to our chair, Mark, and I think we move towards some Q&A now.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Yes, and we will be trying to answer as many people's questions as possible. And we've had quite a few come in, so I'll do my best to rattle through a lot of them. Some of the questions are on sort of similar kinds of themes, and I've also had some questions sent to me in advance as well. So I may well amalgamate one or two people's questions and sort of ask them more generally to some of the panelists. So the first question I shall ask, actually, is the first question that's been sent through, and I thought was a very good one to start with, and quite a simple one. Do we think the government is likely to relax the current planning restrictions to boost the economy? So I suppose for Nella, I'll throw that one at you first, please, and anybody else who has any views on it, please speak up afterwards.
Yeah, I would like to think that they would relax the planning restrictions to boost the economy, which is why the CLA will be asking for the economic development policies, including rural economic development policies, and the NPPF to be pulled forward to the front of any revised national planning policy framework that may come through later on. The planning system has got to deliver sustainable development, and it has three pillars: economy, community, and environment. If we're going to deliver the sort of growth and community and environment that we want to see in the future, then I think that yes, it would be nice to see restrictions removed and economic growth enhanced.
Would any of the other panelists like to add to that?
Yeah, I think if that's okay, Mark, just one comment. Is very clearly yes in my mind. I think we've started to see some sort of puffing out of chests from ministers in the last week. There's a few comments going on around the sort of change around permitted development rights. They're here to stay. Christopher Pincher, the minister, made it very clear last week in a statement that they're very much here to stay, and I think will be bolstered in terms of permitted development rights. And the second point really is around neighbourhood plans. They've just made, I think, a tentative announcement around actually increasing the money available to communities and parishes and groups to produce neighbourhood plans. So I think that suggests to me that there's going to be some fairly radical change coming down the track.
Thank you, Carl. In fact, one of the questions we had specifically was on Class Q. Do you think those rights will be retained? So I'm assuming you're including that within your answers, saying that they will be retained and bolstered as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I'd just like to say,
Tina. Yes,
Mark, I agree. In fact, the Policy Exchange came out with a report this week, which has been endorsed by Robert Jenrick, which suggests a wholesale change to the planning system. I'm a bit with Fenella and Judith on this. I don't think we'll see a wholesale change, but there's a definite move towards planning zones, using development orders and trying to speed up the planning process, and a real commitment to bring forward development. So I think there will be some form of relaxation. What form it will take and how they'll, whether they just tinker around the edges or whether it will be more widespread, remains to be seen. Thanks very much.
Thank you. One of the questions that's sort of come in multiple formats is around the political or the politicisation of decision making, and the way that very often the people who are making the decisions are often not doing it in terms of planning policy, but are doing it because of their political standing. So what are the panel's thoughts on whether or not that needs to change, how it can be improved? I'll perhaps direct that one to John first, but if you can sort of give us your thoughts on how things need to be changed, and particularly the political element being removed from planning, that would be much appreciated.
Yeah, I'll be just get Nicholas's view on this as well. But I think from my perspective, planning is politics in different ways and different means across the country. My background, I started as a local authority planning officer and try to be a fairly forward-thinking, positive soul in life. But the reality is you're constrained by rules and regulation and a political position of where you operate. So there's lots of challenges around that. Conversely, I think it's really important, the shield and the sword point is really important, and how actually we operate here in the industry. And politics, if done properly, and I think certainly some of the national bodies looking at the role Homes England's going to play going forward around infrastructure and major development, I think politics will become easier on that sort of strategic scale. But at a local level, it's very important we all have protection. We're all affected by development in some way, shape or form, very much in our boundary or in our locality. So the politics has an important role to play, but it's how it's managed through the process.
Anything to add, Nicholas?
Yeah, I thank you. I agree with that. There was a paper a couple of years ago that said politics should be taken out of the planning system. I mean, I think that's naive bunk, frankly. You know, where we live and what our neighbours do to where they live and how it affects us is political. It should be political. It isn't just a function of land rights. You know, the street is a public realm. We vote for local authority. So I think all attempts to depoliticise it are naive. And just to talk of the current government, so there's a series of people, of whom I'm one, advising how the planning system needs to change, and saying we do need to, I think, bring the politics forward into the plan making rather than the development control process. There are also experienced, Conservative councillors who will tell the government, hey, but if you do this or do it in this way, I'll have a revolution on my hands. So I think there's radical talk about, ripping it all up. I think more sensible heads, of course I include myself in those, but I think more sensible heads say, what's the way in which we can more effectively engage people in the local plan, where development goes, what it looks like, how it feels, and how it impacts the status quo, so we can bring that the unavoidable politics into the strategy rather than the tactics. And we have, I think without exception, but if it's not without exception, it's very near. We have more focus on the development control process in this country than any other planning system I've studied or anyone who works for me has studied. So, and I think talk of a US zoning system is a little unhelpful. That's got all sorts of connotations, which are very relevant right now.
Could you briefly explain what the zoning system is? Sorry, or just a very short in one paragraph.
In the States, that zoning has often been taken to mean your zoning of what use class in English terms is possible in an area, and it's basically been used often to maintain the suburbanization and very high car parking standards, wrong word, requirements, anywhere. So one of the reasons, if you go downtown in an American city, look at something that's been built in the last 50 years, that it takes up such a small proportion of the land is because it's got vast parking requirements. And so zoning is essentially zoning on use. And I think where we want to go is not zoning on use. I mean, with the limitation of extremities of, we don't want iron smelting works in rural Guildford or wherever. But with that boundary accepted, I think we should be zoning on form and height, and saying, developments of this nature are very easy. If you want to go beyond that, still possible, but you're going to have to go through this process and, essentially the current planning process. And that, I think, is where we were trying to gently nudge the system with our report into a sort of a rational variant of zoning that will work for the UK.
Thank you. I'll move on to the next question, which there's a question: who should be the arbiter of taste and design in the planning process? Nicholas, I think I'll point that one to you again first.
Okay, I'm going to stop after this. Everyone else has to take questions after this. I'm going to mute myself forever. And I'm sorry, I didn't have time to go over this properly in my slightly odd talk. The answer is not me, and the answer is not anyone on this panel. The answer is voters and members of the public. And that if we're going to have a clearer form-based codes which set not what must be built, but the easy way of building, that the best way to do that is in as localized a way as possible. I mean, the government needs to set the parameters. We can't have neighbourhood forum or a parish council demanding platinum taps and sort of level of construction quality that makes things impossible. But a clear process in the plan making or the neighbourhood plan making process within constraints set by the government as to what is acceptable for sort of straight through permissioning, local development orders, whatever it might be. And that process has to be very clearly embedded through visual engagement in the creation of the local plan, but also the nature of politics changes so that when you're voting for person A or person B, you're very clear, you've got a sense of where they want to take it, which is very firm and clear in your head. And so it becomes a proper part of democracy. We need to move the democracy of planning forward as opposed to having it all at the last minute. There are advantages of having it at the last minute, but we've got the balance wrong. We're treating everything as if it's a Gauguin painting as opposed just to a good ordinary.
Thank you. There seems to be a fundamental conflict between the government's localism agenda, so delegating power down to as locally as possible, and the government's requirement for more houses to be built and more building generally. How do we resolve that conflict? How do we stop, or how do we empower local communities to take charge of where development goes within their area, but also ensure that they don't then become a blocker to it? I'm not quite sure who'd like to say that one on. Fenella, possibly you.
Goodness, I mean, the localism agenda is there to stay, and thank goodness for that. Yes, there is a conflict between what do people think at a local level and the need for more houses. I mean, neighbourhood planning is the mechanism for delivering what a village or a community might require over the next 20, 30 years. I think that the original neighbourhood plans were started off very well with the concept of taking what the local plan was saying and actually adding a bit more to that. I think my feeling is that neighbourhood planning has become a little bit more anti-development more recently, probably because some of the villagers are seeing that they spend a lot of time putting all their time and effort into creating a neighbourhood plan, only to see larger sites picked off by perhaps larger developers which are not in local plans. And so that has created some sort of resentment, I think, to neighbourhood planning. So I think we need to try and get neighbourhood planning back on track so that the conflict between delivering housing that people actually do need, we do need more housing out there, and what people actually want to see in their communities over the next 20 or 30 years, that the conflict is removed between those two.
Apologies. Judith, did you want to say something on that?
Yes, I mean, I think it's been disappointing for local people to put in a great deal of effort for putting together a neighbourhood plan is years of work. And I can understand frustration. And I've also seen neighbourhood plans that actually don't really cover housing allocations. So it is a very mixed bag as far as I'm concerned. And I think the government is probably going to try and make sure that, well, it is at the moment, making sure that neighbourhood plans do actually have as much clout as they should. But the thing, of course, you can't work is that there are unintended consequences, or indeed there are things like the pandemic that we're living through that completely alter maybe people's thinking and how they want to live. So planning is fine up to a point, but I don't think you can predict everything, whether it's Brexit or COVID. And I think that's one of the issues.
Thank you. Nicholas, did you want to make a point quickly? You're on mute, Nicholas.
Yeah, sorry, apologies. Yeah, it was just very quickly to say, I mean, I think they are trying to do that. So the amount of funding neighbourhood forums, for example, can get is increased if you're using design codes or allocating sites for housing. But I think there are ways you can gently nudge the process of neighbourhood planning to be pro-development, which I think are happening. That was cool.
And yes, John.
I think just to add to that, I sort of mentioned in my talk about the sort of nibble or the bite, and the bite being sort of around the town and urban extension. But the nibbles is quite an important topic, because what we've seen in a number of villages is speculative development because a local plan is not in play and policies are found wanting. and the development industry is looking. No harm in that in reality. That is exactly what the government's allowing to happen with the changes to sort of 5-year land supply rules. But take small village. I worked in a village place called Lavenham, sort of 15th, 16th century village, a wonderful place, brought up in the wool trade. They took forward a neighbourhood plan on the back of the nibble. They looked at small sites, small scale schemes of 14s and 20s, not one big scheme of 150 houses, and how then around the village those would have formed over many, many years, and looked at design and vernacular ways to do things. Forward-thinking people, it requires strong leadership at the parish level. There are 19,000 town councils and parish councils across the UK. So a lot of people to engage and get leadership through. It does require local authorities to step up and lead on this as well, though.
Thank you very much. We've got 5 minutes left to go, so I'd like to move on quickly to national parks and protected landscapes, and how will we go about making sure that these areas don't get forgotten about. They're not preserved in aspic, which is often the concern of the communities who live there. A lot of the population see national parks as, or believe national parks can be publicly owned, and of course they're not. So how do we make sure that those protected landscapes not only meet the needs of the tourism and the sort of the incoming individuals of which they rely upon, but also actually work for the communities and the businesses that live and work there as well. So Fenella, I might ask you on that one.
Thank you. Well, I am sitting on the DEFRA stakeholder reference group that's looking at the Julian Glover landscapes review, and one of my big attempts is to ensure that the communities and businesses in national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty are kept at the forefront of people's minds when we go through how do we actually deliver what the Glover review is asking us to deliver. And I mean, it comes back to my presentation about levelling up. You know, communities in these areas, in these designated areas, have the same needs as everybody else does. And that means that we need to produce, policy that delivers better quality jobs, including in our designated landscapes. There will always be an issue around scale of development. You know, it's all about producing the right development at the right place at the right time. And it will always be scaled, and there will also be an even more of an impact on landscape that will need to be taken into account. But we mustn't forget, at the end of the day, that these communities need jobs, homes, and services just as everybody else does. And that is what that is my modus operandi on the stakeholder reference group that I sit on.
Thank you, Fenella. Judith, did you want to add a point on that?
Yes, I feel very strongly about this actually, because the concept of putting OMBs and national parks together and possibly tightening the level of control, I think is extremely concerning. The South Downs National Park local plan is sort of a little bit experimental, and I had a long conversation with an officer, a senior officer, who told me that they were monitoring it as it went along, but it was clearly seen as something that was a rather controlling force. And I cited the example of the word tranquility. Shooting is a rural activity. It does generate a certain amount of noise, but it's part of the rural economy, and I thought that was a very worrying decision. And I remain very concerned, and I think the Glover review really does need very careful consideration, and we need to be ready to be sure that we actually promote our point of view that one size does not fit all.
Thank you very much. We've got 2 minutes left, so I will ask 2 further questions. The first one is just briefly about the planning inspectorate. Is there any pressure coming from the planning inspectorate on the planning system? Because an awful lot of applications which are passed immediately by the planning inspector have been obviously rejected by local authorities, and this is resulting in very long waiting times in some situations for a planning inspector to actually review your case. So is there any pressure coming from that direction as well? John?
Yeah, I'm sort of grinning here. It's very topical to me this morning. We've had a decision in this morning from the inspectorate on a site where the council has no land supply, has no local plan, and the site, in my opinion, is very sound and reasonable and has no detrimental impact to the settlement. And the inspectors dismissed the appeal this morning. Not a big scheme. And I think the challenges around how the inspectorate they're a little bit lost for direction at the moment. I think we haven't got clear leadership from ministers, and I think that's coming. I think that's certainly something we're going to be seeing in the coming few weeks around what's going to happen and change. The inspectorate is at a bit of a crossroads. We're looking at lots of garden villages and large strategic growth, but how are we dealing with immediate plan making? Local plans are behind. We're not seeing the opportunity to engage in that process. And still we're seeing some very up and down decisions coming out from the inspectorate. The positives for me here are the inspectorate are going online. The ability to do this conversation this morning is fantastic. We're getting to a broad spectrum of people, and getting the inspectorate engaged in that through the public as well, I think will be more democratic, but also make much more professional decision making. So I think the inspectorate can help us there.
Thank you very much. Before I get to my very final remarks, just one more question about very, very topical due to COVID-19 and the fact that many people are now, as we all are, working from home rather than in offices. Are we going to see a big change in the way that people work as a result of this? Are we going to see a vast reduction in the requirement for office space and sort of far more flexible live work type space being required in the future? John, as you're on screen, I'll let you answer that one.
Okay, I'll probably let Fenella sum up on this because I've been interested in her views. My view is yes, this is an opportunity to broaden the UK, and we've started talking about the Northern Powerhouse in the last sort of 10 years, and we're now talking about change after discussions with government and leadership. I think broadening of where people live will create an opportunity. So working isn't all centred around large cities. We've proved very much in the last 12 weeks we can operate in a different manner. So my hope is for the village high street in a very different way. But I'll let Fenella comment.
Thank you, John. Yes,
very briefly, please, Fenella.
Yes, there's a huge rush to the countryside at the moment, and a huge demand. I think there will be a more demand for office and other types of workspace. And I think rural hubs will become more prevalent. So yes, I think that things are changing. And I think we've all seen the light. We can actually work in a different way. And so let's see what happens next.
It sounds like someone was literally saved by the bell there. Right, that's all for questions. Apologies if I haven't got round to asking your question. If there are any specific questions that you do want answered, if you could email them in to events@cla.org.uk. I noticed there were a couple of questions specifically around taxation as well and things. So if you specifically want an answer to those, please do send that to events@cla.org.uk. So thank you everybody for taking part today. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you for everyone who has been listening in today. Please look out for details of further webinars that CLA are running. You'll see there are 2 in conversation with there, with Professor Alistair Driver and with Victoria Prentice coming up very soon. This session has been recorded and will be available afterwards. We hope to get it onto the website within 48 hours. So if there are any bits you've missed or want to sort of hear again, please go and look on there. So just a final thank you to everybody, and wishing you all the very best, and goodbye.